Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. Hey everybody, welcome back to the For Food's Sake podcast. Today we talk with Charles C. Mann. Charles is a scientific journalist and an award-winning and best-selling author of the books 1491 and also 1493, which are two books about the Americas before and after the arrival of Columbus. He's also a contributing editor for Science magazine, for The Atlantic, and for Wired magazine. But today we're talking about his latest book, which came out this year, which is called The Wizard and the Prophet, Two Groundbreaking Scientists and Their Conflicting Visions of the Future of Our Planet. And so we discussed this book, which is about two remarkable 20th century scientists, about William Vogt and Norman Borlaug, and their competing visions for the future of our planet. And what's so fascinating about these characters is that their opposing ideas and visions for the future of our planet still dominate the discussion that we have today about agriculture and about climate change. You could say that they're the kind of intellectual forefathers of the ideas and the frameworks that we use today to approach the environmental dilemmas that we face. And Charles does a fantastic job in this book of providing an overview of their respective visions for our future, but he doesn't take a side in this debate of either the wizard or the prophet. He doesn't offer a solution to climate change, but just presents the two dominant paths that have emerged. So if you're interested in questions such as, how are we going to feed 10 billion people by 2050, and how are we going to survive as a species, which, if you're tuning into this podcast, I suppose you are, then I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. So now, without further preamble, here is Charles C. Mann. We have Charles Mann on the line. Charles, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So your new book provides a really interesting framework for understanding what's got to be the most important debate of our time, which is, how are we going to survive as a species? How, given the problems of climate change that we're facing, given the fact that by 2050 we'll be roughly 10 billion people living on this planet, and kind of all the related challenges that we have with that. And you've categorized the way we think about this issue and the solutions that are currently being proposed to this issue into kind of two broad camps, into two opposing worldviews. On the one hand, you've got the prophets, and on the other hand, you've got the wizards. And you focus really on two 20th century scientists, William Vogt, who represents the prophets, and Norman Borlaug, who represents the wizards. Who are kind of pivotal in providing, as you say, the basic intellectual blueprints behind these opposing worldviews. So, as you acknowledge in the book, most people have probably never heard of either of these scientists. So I guess my first question would be, who are these two individuals? Why are they called the prophets and the wizards? And why should we care about them?
Well, the two individuals are, as you said, Norman Borlaug and William Vogt. And they're called prophets and wizards because I called them that. And I chose that because when I explained their viewpoints to a friend of mine who's a philosopher and asked what I should call it, he said, well, that's simple. Borlaug is a Schumpeterian technophiliac meliorist, and I just said, no way. I'm not going to do that. And then he gave me a name for the other guy, Vogt, that involved a German word that had at least 10 syllables. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to have to come up with a name myself. And so I chose wizards, as in techno-whizzes, and prophets, because these people are often, the other side is often, sort of prophets in the wilderness. And Borlaug, the reason that he's important, in addition to being the central character of my book, is that he is the main figure in what's been called the Green Revolution, which is the combination of advanced technology, a combination of three sort of advanced agricultural technologies. The first is breeding super productive plants. The second is high intensity fertilizer. And the third is irrigation. And you put these together and you can double, triple, or even quadruple cereal yields, for wheat, rice, maize, and other cereals. And the result is that the world's production of cereals, which is the basic foodstuff of humankind, exploded enormously in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And this had a huge effect on human life all over the world. And one way of summarizing it is to say that in the early 1970s, when I was going to high school, something on the order of 40% of the world was malnourished. That means that the people at some point during the year didn't get enough food to live adequately. About 4 out of 10 out of of the people in the world. And now that figure is something like 8 out of 100 or 9 out of 100. In other words, there's been a dramatic reduction in the number of people who are starving. This despite the enormous increase in human population at the same time. And this has had just huge impacts on life all over the world. And so the idea behind this is that Borlaug is a model. And what he exemplifies is the idea that science and technology, properly applied, can let us produce our way out of our dilemmas. We don't have to change society. We just make more. And it's a very powerful image. And if you talk to people in climate change or in water or in energy, very often they'll say, at one point or another, we have to do for X what Borlaug did for agriculture.
Right.
And so,
okay. Yeah, go on.
That's the wizard. That's wizard. The prophets say, okay, you can do this. You can produce more, but you're going to break the ecosystems on which life depends. And they say the fundamental insight here, and this is first put together by Vogt, who was an ornithologist in the middle of the 20th century, and who wrote the first sort of modern "We're all going to hell" book, is that the Earth is governed by fundamental ecological processes with limits that we transgress to our peril. And you'll see this idea under many names: ecological limits, planetary boundaries, carrying capacity. There's a bunch of different names, and they all have to do with the idea that we can't just expand, because we'll cross these limits and then we'll be in deep trouble. And they see that, yes, this kind of modern industrial agriculture has produced much, much more, but at the same time, it's imposed huge environmental costs. And those environmental costs are eventually going to come back and really hurt us and leave us worse off than before.
Yeah, I think for me at least, a useful way also of understanding their differences is in the example that you use in the book when you compare kind of organic, like a small organic agriculture versus a conventional larger farm, and where, the question that's often asked in agriculture is, which one is more productive? And prophets and wizards, they disagree about the answer because they actually disagree about the question. Could you elaborate on that idea?
Sure. The idea is, which is more productive? And that question is asked as if the idea of what is productivity is unproblematic. And typically wizards say, well, no. What I mean by that is which produces more calories per acre. And the answer is rather clear. In almost every study that I'm aware of, industrial agriculture produces more calories per acre. And so for wizards, this, end of question. But the prophets say, wait a minute, that's focusing on a single aspect. And that's a little bit like saying, which is the best car? And you focus only on how fast they go. You don't care about safety. You don't care about the space that's in the car. You don't care about what it looks like. You're only focusing on a single variable. And they say, what about the costs of agriculture? Fertilizer runoff, erosion, eutrophication. You can just list an enormous number of costs of industrial agriculture. And those have to be offset against the productivity in terms of calories per acre. And when you do that, the answer is much different than if you just simply look at the productivity.
Yeah, and I think where their respective visions kind of also ultimately fundamentally disagree is about our relationship to nature, right, to the natural world.
Right. Yeah, and the wizards then respond back to the prophets. That's all very nice about the pollution, but those are problems that we clean up. The fundamental thing that we care about is how much we get to eat. And they see the earth as, basically like a kind of a petri dish. And you pour in the right chemicals, you put in the right seeds, and you yield the maximum amount of calories for people to eat. Simple as that. And if there's undesirable consequences, you turn on the science machine and you fix them. The prophets say, no, the earth, these agricultural ecosystems are systems with their own integrity, their own rules, and their own limits, and you have to work with those systems. You can't ignore them.
Yeah, I think this is probably as well why. So I think a question I often hear when I kind of discuss this idea of prophets and wizards, and which I've also seen in talks that you've given, people always ask, okay, but why do we have to end up in one camp? Why is it prophets versus wizards? Why is it either or? But I guess maybe one of the reasons why people tend to gravitate towards one rather than staying smack in the middle is because at the end of the day, they're asking different questions, right?
Right.
So it's inevitable. They have a different worldview.
Right. There's no physical law. I mean, we're not talking about physics here that says you have to be in one end or the other. But nonetheless, people tend toward aggregate in that way because these questions involve deep perceptions about, what life is and how people should live and what human beings are. And if you see people as, these sort of creatures that are embedded in a biological matrix that are profoundly affected by that, the ecosystems in which they're involved, then you tend to be a prophet. And if you see people as, these clever tool makers and the earth as a set of things that we can manipulate freely, then you tend to be a wizard.
Yeah, and I think maybe another way that would help people better understand these differences between prophets and wizards is kind of looking at the modern equivalents of William Vogt and Norman Borlaug. Could you name some names maybe that people could relate to that in today's society, kind of leaders that you think would represent these respective movements?
Yeah, I'm not sure for Swedish folks who I would name, but for people in the United States, an obvious candidate would be somebody like Bill McKibben or possibly Naomi Klein, or I hope I'm going to pronounce this right, Gro Brundtland. Have I pronounced that correctly?
I think so.
Right. Okay. These kind of environmental leaders, and then almost all the tech figures that you see are then very much wizards. And so you'll talk about people like Nathan Myhrvold or Bill Gates, those kind of people who are always sort of saying what we need here is tech. Let's have a techno fix. And there's a fundamental argument between these people, and they typically don't like each other.
Yeah, I think two more figures that I'm thinking of, they're again U.S. based though, is Wendell Berry and Wes Jackson on the side of the prophets.
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't sure. I was trying to think of names that would be familiar to people outside the United States. Absolutely. Wendell Berry, the great writer who writes from a small farm and writes about the rhythms of agriculture and working by hand and so forth. And then the writer Michael Pollan, I think, would slide into this camp as well for agriculture. And then there's a whole raft of people, again, talking about agriculture, who work in the big companies, who think that, and in also the major universities, who kind of think that all this is nonsense. And you'll see they're good people. I should immediately say that there's good people on both sides. And I'm thinking of a prominent agricultural researcher named Ken Kassman, who works at the University of Nebraska and has dedicated his life to raising corn and wheat yields with the goal of feeding poor people around the world. I mean, he spent 50 years in his career doing that. But if you ask him about the kind of, quote unquote, organic farm vision, he just says, no, that's just simply not going to work. Don't be such a sentimental sap. We have to feed people.
Yeah, no, I think you raise a really important point there because especially today where I think at least amongst kind of millennials, I think the vision of prophets can be very appealing, the kind of environmental movement. And there's often a lot of scorn, and you mentioned this in your book as well, towards figures like Norman Borlaug, who dedicated his life to increasing crop yields very much for humanity. And, he would be booed off stage sometimes. And that just, it's crazy because it's a different world vision, but it's still a noble one.
Yes, it's very much. I mean, this is a guy who spent his life in very poor circumstances, worked unimaginably hard in very difficult places, didn't own a house until he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. So at that point he is 60 some years old, and he takes the money, he gives all of it away except for, I think it was $60,000, which he uses to buy his grandparents' farm, and he gives that to his sister.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the kind of guy he was. He was a very, very decent guy. That isn't to say that some of the agriculture that he led didn't lead to bad consequences, but there's no way that he was a corporate shill, an apologist for greed, a person who didn't care about the environment or anything like that.
Yeah, I'd just like to stress a little bit more on these achievements, not just of Norman Borlaug, but just to kind of stress how entrenched and strongly people believe in these competing visions today. So I'm thinking here with the wizards of the Haber-Bosch process. Could you talk a little bit briefly about that process and why it was so important for agriculture?
Okay. Well, the fundamental a fundamental problem for agriculture is that plants need a lot of nitrogen, and they need it primarily to make a compound called rubisco, which is a key part of photosynthesis itself. And rubisco has just a ton of nitrogen in it. So you need, if you want to have photosynthesis, you need nitrogen. There's a huge amount of nitrogen everywhere. It's in the atmosphere. It's 3/4 of the atmosphere. But the form of nitrogen that's in the atmosphere, which is two nitrogen atoms bound very closely together, can't be used by plants. The plants, for better or worse, don't have a mechanism to break it apart. Instead, nitrogen has to be in other forms, which are nitrates and nitrites and so forth. And there are many ways of breaking down nitrogen into these plant available forms. But if you're really going to produce a lot, you need to have more than is typically available in soils. And the way to do that is to fertilize. And for millennia, farmers have used manure, of various types. There's green manures and brown manures and night soil and so forth, to provide that extra nitrogen. They didn't know that was what it was doing, but that's what they were doing. And that is typically hard to do when you're producing a lot of food. It's just simply very difficult to get as much nitrogen in there. So beginning in the 19th century, people began to use high-intensity fertilizers, which came from big deposits of bird guano. These were very limited. And then in the beginning of the 20th century, two German scientists, Fritz Haber and then later Karl Bosch, invented a way to make ammonia synthetically, and that is the key ingredient of making synthetic fertilizer. Fertilizer you could make in highly concentrated form in a factory, put it in a bag, and ship it around the world. And the amount of fertilizer that is made around the world is absolutely enormous. And it is the reason that the plants that were developed by Borlaug, he was a plant breeder, were able to grow so much because we were able to provide the nitrogen necessary for them to photosynthesize enough. And there's all these estimates. There's a scientist named Vaclav Smil, who is probably the leading figure in here, and he estimates that the nitrogen that produces food for about 40% of the human race comes from the Haber-Bosch process. And so if that process suddenly vanished and ceased to work, about 40% of humankind would simply not have enough to eat.
Yeah, that's an incredible figure. I mean, you say in your book it's more than 3 billion people, essentially, that kind of almost attribute their existence to these two German chemists, essentially.
Right. And so this is one of those little known things that's in the background of human existence, is that there's these large factories that use about 1% of the world's electricity that are churning out vast quantities of fertilizer, which is basically nitrogen in a form that plants can use. Now, this fertilizer has literally spread everywhere on Earth and has caused enormous environmental problems as well. About 40, when people put on fertilizer, there's no way to inject every plant with it. It's sort of scattered on the ground, and as a result, some of it doesn't go into plants. And the best estimates that I've seen is that something on the order of 40% of the fertilizer we apply gets washed off in one way or another. Some of it goes up into the air, and it creates there's nitrous oxides that cause a form of pollution in cities and affect people with asthma. When they go very high into the air, it's nitrous oxide, and that interferes with the ozone layer. And a lot of it gets washed into rivers, which then go into the oceans. And nitrogen in the ocean, fertilizer in the ocean is still fertilizer. It feeds these huge blooms of microorganisms, algae, and small aquatic plants. They die. They go rain down to the bottom. Microorganisms eat them. The microorganisms grow in such a frenzy because they're getting all this breakfast that they suck all the oxygen out of the air. And so many of the coastlines in industrialized nations and increasingly developing nations like India and China are ringed by these dead zones. There's a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that last year was about 8,000 square miles. There's one in the Bay of Bengal, which is the sort of bit of the Indian Ocean that's to the east of India, and that was about 20,000 square miles. I mean, these are very, very large areas in which there simply isn't enough oxygen for life to survive.
Right, and
this is caused by fertilizer in the Haber-Bosch process, and it's a byproduct of industrial agriculture.
Exactly, and this is kind of the prophet's response, right? It's that at best we're kicking the can down the road, and that the solution to all of these huge environmental problems and to climate change is not by adding more fuel to the fire. It's putting the brakes on. Right,
and so you can. So again, let's talk about fertilizer. Wizards say, what? They say, you're right, nitrogen pollution is a problem. So why don't we genetically engineer maize so that it produces its own nitrogen in the way soybeans and other legumes produce nitrogen. Clover produces nitrogen thanks to its association with symbiotic bacteria that can break down into this. So why don't we make maize and import those traits, put it into maize, and that way we won't have to fertilize it. And again, we'll put in science in there, and we'll do this the right way. To which the profits go. That's exactly like you say. That's like dealing with a fire by pouring gasoline on it. Why don't we instead reconfigure agriculture so that it more closely mimics natural ecosystems, which tend to keep the nitrogen in there and dramatically reduce the amount of fertilizer that we have to apply?
Also, in terms of next steps, I guess, for the wizards, you talk in your book about C4 photosynthesis and about gene editing technology more generally. Could you briefly talk about what those ideas are and kind of what the technological vision is for wizards in the future?
Well, we're talking about GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and one of the interesting things that I learned about is that when I visited, I should immediately back off and say that a lot of the research on this that I'm talking about in the book is from a chain of public laboratories that Borlaug was indirectly responsible for creating. After he did what he had done for wheat, other people, very much with his approval, said, let's do it for other crops. And so there are now, I believe there are 16 of these international laboratories that are trying to develop more productive crops and then give them away. So we're not talking about corporations here. And typically these people in the public laboratories look at the products of contemporary gene editing, sort of Monsanto's Roundup Ready crops with a little bit of contempt. They sort of say, you're using this fabulous technology to sell more patented goo, make more money. What they want to do is we want to develop more productive crops and put them in the hands of poor people and let them use them themselves without charging them any money. So that's what we're talking about. And there's a number of these kind of moonshot projects that are trying to produce dramatically more productive crops. One of the ones that I describe in the book, because I think it's fascinating and it's also one of the furthest along, is what's called C4 rice. There are two. Photosynthesis evolved, a billion or so years ago, and it only happened once. But there's been a bunch of kind of modifications of it, ways that it plants have evolved to make it more or less effective. And ordinary photosynthesis is pretty inefficient. But there's a type of photosynthesis called C4 photosynthesis. The name just refers to a molecule with 4 carbon atoms that's involved in the process. It's a very dull name.
Yeah, nothing to do with the explosive.
Yeah, nothing to do with the explosive. And if any of you have seen a lawn, you've seen the effects of photosynthesis. If you mow a common lawn, you'll see that the regular European grass grows, relatively slowly afterwards. But there's a kind of grass called crabgrass that's kind of a weedy form of grass that's almost universally present in European-style lawns, and it grows twice as fast. You'll see these isolated tufts with these broad blades jumping up much faster than the rest. And that is because crabgrass is C4 photosynthesis, and the regular lawn is ordinary or C3 photosynthesis. So this type of modification of photosynthesis is much more productive. C4 photosynthesis has evolved on its own 60 or 80 times in the plant kingdom. There's a little bit of disagreement about how many times it's evolved independently. And so the idea is that most green plants probably have precursor genes that would let them switch on and become go from regular photosynthesis to C4 photosynthesis. And so this project that's headquartered, directors in Oxford, but the bulk of the people there are in the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, is called the C4 Photosynthesis Consortium. And they are essentially trying to turn rice into a C4 plant, which would mean it could grow faster, so you could get more crops per year. You might be able to increase the yield of each crop. It would be a much faster, more robust crop. It's an amazing technical challenge because you're essentially creating a new species. You're not with the genes inside of rice itself.
Okay.
Or various analogs that are from similar species that are, for technical reasons, easier to work with.
So we've heard a lot about the kind of wizard side of things and their vision, and usually we often hear from the prophets in response to these ideas of wizards, right? So it's prophets saying, no, this is hubris, these grand illusions that you wizards have of our dominance over nature. So I guess what's the kind of vision for prophets then? How do they see the world in 50 years?
Well, the prophets are not just responding, but they have their own vision. And one of the implicit parts of the wizard's vision is that agriculture is drudgery, and the fewer people who do it, the better. People achieve their maximum liberty and freedom to do what they want to if they all get packed into cities, and that they can maximize their individual opportunities. And so, the farm is useful, but it's best to have as few people as possible. And ideally, the land would be empty, and you would have these super productive crops tended by robots while people lived in the cities and did their wonderful intellectual things. To prophets, this seems horrible. They see people thrive best when they're in small communities where they're connected to the soil and connected to each other. And so this recipe for depopulating the countryside just seems anti-human. A recipe for enemy. And so what they would like is, many more people in the countryside, in these kind of smaller connected communities with these farms that are much more like natural ecosystems. And I've given a couple examples of them in the book, where you are growing many, many more different types of crops. And you have it's a very sophisticated kind of agriculture. That in many ways was pioneered by Native Americans in places like Mexico, where you have the milpa, these kind of polyculture farms where you're growing 6 or 7 crops in the same place. And these are highly productive. They are known to be extremely sustainable. People in Mesoamerica have been growing crops in the same places for 7,000 years. And there's just not that many places on Earth where you have a record of people having done that without ruining them. You go to the Fertile Crescent, and much of the Fertile Crescent isn't so fertile anymore because the soil has been poisoned by incompetent agriculture, mainly from bad irrigation. And you can go to the coast of Peru or southern Mexico, where people do irrigate just as much, and things are okay. And so that's a record that prophets look at and say, that's something that we should aspire to. I don't know exactly what the definition of sustainable is, but being able to do agriculture in the same place and have it still be productive for 7,000 years, that's pretty good.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to point out as well that just because it's not using, it's not got that kind of techno-optimism attached to it, it doesn't mean it's backwards. Like you said, it's still incredibly sophisticated. And I think one of the ways I like thinking about it is the way that, Wes Jackson talks about it as, nature as measure, that nature is incredibly complex, but also kind of a closed, complete system where there is essentially no waste. And the best we can really do is aspire to, nature is the bar. If we can aspire to mimic, to replicate nature as much as possible, then we're doing a pretty great job.
Right. And in the book, I give an example of this kind of thing. There's many around the world, but I picked, one, partly because it's such a good example and partly because I really like the guy. His name is Lloyd Nichols, and he's in Northwest Illinois. And he has a farm that grows 1,000 or so different crop varieties. Unbelievably complex system there. And it requires, 20 different people working on it because it's so complicated. It's a huge amount of information management because each crop has its own requirements, its own schedule, its own needs, and has to be looked at separately. And by clever rotation, by using the latest technology for integrated pest management, by having solar-powered greenhouses, by monitoring his crops by drone, by a whole bunch of different things, he's able to create an enormously complex system that, just like the advanced wheat and soybean farms next door, where they're with their huge tractors and so forth. Both of them are exotic, cosmopolitan, technological objects, but they're very, very different in what they're trying to do.
Yeah. One of the things, though, that, kind of as we talk about these two opposing viewpoints, one of the things that I struggle with is that, for me, it really goes beyond the intellectual. These viewpoints for me, they're not neutral. They can't be divorced from the kind of powerful interests that often support them. And I know you mentioned that kind of a lot of the C4 initiatives today, kind of on the Wizards side, are often publicly funded. But I'm thinking here on the record so far, when you look at GMOs and the reasons often why people are opposed to GMOs or industrialized foods, is that they often have the backing of these large agrochemical firms, Monsanto, Bayer, Syngenta, you name it. And of the meat and dairy industry and all the kind of, big food, let's call it. And so for me, the way I often see this debate between wizard and prophets is more one that's kind of a David versus Goliath situation almost, where you have this, this little guy, the prophet, that's being repeatedly outdone by, a much more well-equipped wizard that's got the resources and the finance and the politics behind it. And so I naturally sympathize for this little guy. And so I guess my question is there really a choice? I feel like in many ways the decision's already been made because we've been on this wizard trajectory, from my point of view, almost since day one. It's kind of the status quo. And, can we really see this changing? Is it really a choice?
So I guess there's two answers to that, one sort of theoretical and one practical. Here's the theoretical answer. Part of the reason that we have been on the wizard's trajectory is that over time, nations in almost every part of the world have set up legal and regulatory mechanisms and systems that promote it. And so if in the United States, which is, of course, what I'm most familiar with, if you want to grow, many hectares of wheat, You can go to the local government. You can get the subsidized seed, so you can plant it and don't have to pay for it until you get the harvest. You can get special terms on the machines you need to process it. You can join an association and get tax breaks until the crops come in. You can get special loans that are backed by the government at super low interest rates. There's a whole variety of mechanisms that make it possible for this kind of agriculture to do well. And in most countries, as you can imagine, larger companies have gotten very interested in this and have captured the regulations and made them to benefit themselves. And this is the kind of thing that sort of naturally happens in democracies that allow special interests to have their say. And because these systems are human-made, they can obviously be changed. The farm that I was talking about with Lloyd Nichols in Illinois, that farm is highly productive, but it's not eligible for any of these things. Most of his crops aren't on the list of approved crops. He can't get the seeds. The machinery that he uses is extremely small scale and specialized. It's not on the list of things that are approved. He can't get the commodity loans. And so as far as the state, local, and federal systems goes, he doesn't exist. But there's nothing that says, there's not a law of physics that you couldn't change that. Now, what would it take to change it? And that's pretty much would take what takes to change any kind of system, which is a social movement. It's pretty much, we know the rule. If enough people yell and scream, even in an imperfect democracy such as the one that I live in, eventually things will change. And so it would be necessary for prophets to get together and yell about this. And so far, they haven't done that.
Right. And it's not just in agriculture, right? I mean, you talk in the book extensively about the exact same debates happening between wizards and prophets in water, with energy.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And, so in water, take an example. I mean, probably the most immediate environmental problem that we have in the world, and immediate in terms of, pressing right now, today, is the fact that large numbers of people don't have adequate access to water, and there is a limited water supply. And the wizard's answer to that is almost always desalination. And so that you have plans to have in California, for example, 20 plus large-scale desalination plants. Now, desalination then is a process that has inherent environmental issues. One is that the desalination has to take place where there's a lot of salt water, and then it has to be transported to where it's needed, so you need to have big pipelines. And the second is the ocean is actually full of salt, and so you have to get rid of the salt, which is highly toxic and very difficult to dispose of in a way that doesn't cause environmental damage. So prophets say, rather than doing this, which is expensive and environmentally damaging, why don't we save water and use it more thriftily? And this seems like a very logical argument to me. And one of the first things you could point to is that cities all over the world, Europe, the United States, Asia, routinely lose huge amounts of water to leaky pipes. Remember Cape Town, South Africa, which ran out of water earlier this year, or almost ran out of water?
Yeah. Cape
Town loses, I believe the figure is, a third of its water to leaky pipes.
Yeah,
that's crazy, right? That's crazy. And and Philadelphia, 40% of its water, Philadelphia in the United States. I mean, and the fact is that we just don't pay enough attention to infrastructure. We would significantly reduce the demand for Wizard solution if prophets would get together and march and say, no, we need to be more thrifty. But in the history of the world, there has never been a street full of people waving signs about leaky pipes. It has just never happened.
Right. Yeah. And I guess that brings me on to one of my final points, which is, what is at stake for choosing one path over another? And I'd like to quote just a short paragraph of yours from your article in The Atlantic on your book, if you don't mind. It is as if humankind were packed into a bus racing through an impenetrable fog. Somewhere ahead is a cliff, a calamitous reversal of humanity's fortunes. Nobody can see exactly where it is, but everybody knows that at some point the bus will have to turn. The problem is, wizards and prophets disagree about which way to yank the wheel. Each is certain that following the other's ideas will send the bus over the cliff. As they squabble, the number of passengers keeps rising. So, are the stakes, I guess my question is, are they really that high if we choose one path over another?
I'm not sure. I think wizards and prophets are each convinced that the other sides won't work and will lead inevitably to problems. Prophets sincerely believe that if we keep going the line of industrial agriculture, we're going to end up with an ecological calamity. Wizards sincerely believe that if we follow what the prophets do, we're going to doom many, many people in poor places to much worse lives than they could do, and there will be famines and all this awful stuff. So I don't think there's any question about the sincerity of each other's belief. I do question about whether either side is accurate. The future is much more. It's much more uncertain, I think, than either side is willing to admit. We just simply don't know, and no matter what you do, it involves a leap into the unknown, and you can't eliminate the possibility that when you're taking leaps into the unknown, that you might be successful. And so I think that it's quite possible that either path could work out. The problem is that neither side would want to live in the future the other side wants.
One final point, one final question, Charles. You interweave one final, almost a third viewpoint into your book, which is the viewpoint of Lynn Margulis, where you talk about her vision, which is neither one of prophets or wizards. So both wizards and prophets, as you pointed out, they see a different future. They envision a different future. What's the third viewpoint of Lynn Margulis?
Okay, Lynn Margulis was a very, very prominent biologist who lived down the street from me, and so I happened to know her not well. And she thought of me as a kind of sweet, sentimental sap, and the reason was that I just couldn't, in her view, that I just couldn't wrap my head around how biology works and what it means. And in her view, and I think if you are serious about this, you have to say that biology does say this. There's two lessons. The first is that from Darwin, the fundamental insight that Darwin had, she said, and I very much agree with her, is that biological rules apply to everything. There's not like turtles have their own special, rules of evolution or something like that, or there's no exceptions. They're rules. They're laws. And, evolution applies to us. Evolution applies to the protozoa. Evolution applies to the passenger pigeon. The rules are for everything. We're not special. As a kind of a Copernican revolution for biology. We're not special. She used to say, "Oh, you think we're special." And so here's another rule she would say. When every now and then a species escapes its natural bounds. Ordinarily, species of whatever sort are kept within roughly defined limits, by pests, parasites, lack of resources, and a host of things. But every now and then, they'll escape their natural bounds. And what species do, what life does then, is grow like mad until it hits the limit, and then bang, very bad things happen. And the sort of paradigmatic example of that would be protozoa in a petri dish. You take a petri dish, you fill it full of nutrient goo, you put a couple of protozoa in there, and they eat and reproduce and eat and reproduce and eat and reproduce until bang, they hit the edge of the petri dish. At which point, they either drown in their own wastes, starve for lack of resources, or both. And that's life. She said that's what life does. So when we see people overrunning the planet, it's because we have, by our cleverness, removed all the limits, and we're like the protozoa in the petri dish, and we're going to overrun the planet, and we're going to smack into the walls, and then we're going to wipe ourselves out, and that's what life does. So, people like me in the United States who say, "Oh, why doesn't Congress care about climate change? Why aren't we doing anything effective to prevent disaster? Lynn would look at you and say, well, duh. Do you think the protozoa in the petri dish look up and say, oh my gosh, look, the edge is coming up, we better drastically stop reproducing? No, they just let her rip. And that's what life does. And so from her point of view, the wizards and the prophets are equally deluded because they're trying to do something that life doesn't do, which is restrain itself. And so we should just get over it. and grow up, put on our big boy pants, and stop whining.
Well, I don't want to finish on that morbid point. So I guess final.
So I would argue, however, that there is a chance that we are special.
Right.
And so that's something to be. You have to listen to Lynn, but also her conclusion is something to be demonstrated, not proven. Just like the people who assume that we are special, that should be demonstrated, not proven. And I would say that in the past couple of centuries, humankind has dramatically changed society in ways that suggest that we could do it. I mean, just think, it is 1800 and you're in 1800 Sweden, right? How many women are allowed to have property, vote, participate in public life, or go to school? Basically zero.
Right.
In 1800 Sweden, Sweden is a small but enthusiastic participant in a worldwide trade in slaves. They're dominated by the British, but every European country in the United States and all Latin American nations, all the Latin American colonies are enthusiastic participants in this global trade. And something like somewhere between 1 out of 3 and 2 out of 3 people on Earth exist in a state of unfree labor. And now the number, the International Labor Organization says it's something like it's under 30 million. That's a huge number of people, and it's awful, and it needs to be stopped. But it's just nowhere like what it was in 1800. And all of this happened because determined people, got out on the streets, risked ridicule, and said, we have to change this. And societies all over the world changed. In dramatic ways, and both the suppression of women and slavery are foundational human institutions.
Right.
If you read the Code of Hammurabi, which is the oldest legal code I believe that we know of, about a third of it has to do with what you can do with the people that you buy and sell and own. And women, of course, there is no society that we know of that in which women weren't suppressed by men. And these have both enormously changed in a couple of centuries. So to me, it would be just a tremendously ironic, I guess, if we were able to do these things. And then, climate change seems like really easy compared to that.
Right, and if you only have to read Steve Pinker's books as well to look at the level of violence, which has dramatically decreased, and that's just another positive point.
And so we obviously can do things. There's quite a good book by Joshua Goldstein Rose called Winning the War on War. And he sort of systematically looks at the decline of violence and concludes that all these international institutions that we have, the EU, the United Nations, the Organization of American States, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, all of them have actually dramatically reduced the level of war. And so they really work, contrary to our sort of intuitions when we read the newspapers. So we can actually do things. I guess the question is whether we will.
Yeah, I think that's a nicer note to finish on. Well, here's to proving Lynn Margulis wrong, I guess, demonstrating that she's wrong. And Charles, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today. I had a fantastic time, and your book is absolutely fantastic. Maybe finish just by telling people where they can get it and where they can follow your work and what you're up to. Okay,
well, they can get it in any English language bookstore or in Amazon or your local bookseller will order. There are various foreign editions coming out. The first one is the Dutch edition, and then that I know of, the German edition is coming out later. There's an Italian edition. There's already an English edition. As in Great Britain, and so you can get them there. And I guess I have a Twitter account, which is Charles C. Mann. At Charles C. Mann. And right now I'm working on a book about the American West.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Charles.
My pleasure.
That is it for now, guys. As always, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by subscribing via iTunes, by rating and reviewing the show via iTunes. You can find, stream, and listen to the podcast on all of your favorite podcast apps, or you can go directly to our website, that's www.forfoodsake.me, and stream them directly from there. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The social media handle for all those platforms is For Food's Sake Me. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time.